This is the Lumix S5, the first generation. So it's a 24 megapixel full frame camera, and it's not one that I was gonna get. You may know I've been shooting on the X-T4 for a little while at this point, and I absolutely love that camera. I use it for my paid work, I use it for my personal work, and I use it to shoot the majority of my YouTube videos, and I absolutely love using that camera. But I've started shooting a lot more events and photo shoots that require a lot better low light performance. Enter full frame. So I didn't want to spend a fortune getting into the full frame market. I already have my Leica Q Type 116, which I absolutely love and is perfect for wide angle and documentary style images. However, I wanted something that could match that color palette and also be a just general all-rounder. So I wanted something with a good 50mm prime lens because that's focal length I'm very, very used to after years of shooting it. Eventually I stumbled on the Lumix 50mm f1.8. Now this is an S series lens and it's fully weather sealed, and for all intents and purposes it is a rebranded Leica lens. Now, that's something we can talk on in another video. It's not a review of this lens today, but I was very interested in this lens for what it could provide for a reasonable price. So I opted for this lens, which meant opting for a body. And the S5 is the one that ticks the boxes. Now I'm going to start this by saying, yes, the S5 is not the best autofocus video camera. However, I don't do a lot of video work, and any professional level video work I'll be doing, I'm more than happy to manual focus in. Now, the reason it's not the best at autofocus video work is because it's contrast detect. Now, Panasonic uses their own depth by defocus system, which means you get some pulsing in your image when you're doing video work using autofocus. However, as a primarily stills photographer, that's not an issue for me because it doesn't pulse. It gets your target when you're trying to take a still and it captures it. And a lot of videographers talk about this camera, but not a lot of photographers do. So I wanted a cheap, reliable, weather sealed, dual card slot, full frame camera, ideally for under £1,000. This body was £600, this lens was £200. Obviously, both of these items have been bought used, but I'm always happy buying used gear as long as it's been inspected and comes with a little bit of buyer protection. So, this is a first impressions video of the Lumix S5. So what are my first impressions? Well, it's a big, black brick of a camera. It is a very typical DSLR shaped camera, and that's by no means a bad thing when I'm using it purely from a work perspective. The little indent that it has in its grip makes it really nice to hold for long sessions. The dials feel really, really rigid on this. They're really, really nice, very clicky. They don't feel like you're going to accidentally move them, and overall stability is the whole thing with this camera. It feels really sturdy. I feel like I could take this camera to Antarctica and have it be the one camera I know wouldn't die. Now obviously I'm not going to test that theory because I can't afford a trip to Antarctica, but there we go. It has a 24 megapixel full frame sensor that, from my comparisons, is the closest sensor I can find to that on the original Leica Q. Now that is important to me because that means when I'm color grading my images and I'm using this and then my Leica Q from a wide angle, it means that grading them together is going to make life a lot easier. And again, in those working situations, having the dual card slots, fantastic. Now, I don't particularly find the camera inspiring to use, but that's not the point of this camera. When it comes to my enjoyable stuff, it is my backup body. When it comes to my own personal hobby photography, my main thing is going to be my Q and my X-T4. There is another video of something Fujifilm coming out soon, so make sure you stay subscribed for that. Now, there are some flaws with this camera, and one of the big ones for me is the viewfinder. Now, it's a good enough viewfinder in terms of being able to compose your image, as well as it's fast enough pace that you don't feel like you're ever going to miss anything. However, I do find that the viewfinder is quite low resolution compared to my other two cameras, and that's something that I know was improved with the Lumix S5 too, but I just don't have enough reasons to buy that camera. So that for me is definitely the biggest con. The second con is arguably that it's a contrast detect focus system. Now, while I've just explained that that's fantastic for photos, if I did want this to be my main video camera, it wouldn't be able to step into that role over that of my X-T4 for talking head videos specifically. For travel videography, I don't think I'd have any issues with it at all. And that's something to bear in mind. Another couple of positives that I wasn't really expecting is the battery life. It's absolutely fantastic on this camera. It's really hard to burn through a battery. And again, I am using this mainly for photos. I'm sure if I was using it as a video only camera, then I would be going through those batteries a lot quicker. Another huge pro for this camera is Lumix's, at this point, rightly so, famous in-body stabilization. This is crazy. I can easily get images down to 1/8 of a second, you know. I did a lot of nighttime photography in Warsaw recently, and some of the images that I was able to get handheld are just ludicrous how slow I could set that shutter. So really, this thing absolutely delivers when it comes to IBIS. Now again, I am very much an advocate for saying IBIS is not the most necessary thing in the world, but when you're using it in a paid scenario, it's definitely a big nice to have. Now, jumping back, another thing that I don't like about this camera is the menu system. I find the menus on this camera so overwhelming, so much so that I set an hour or so to delve into those menus fully with the manual, set everything as I wanted it, and then I never go back into it. I have a queue menu, which I have a few things set up on, but there's so many buttons on this camera that I have things shortcutted to that I never really have a need to go back into the menus anymore. And frankly, I'm quite glad. Now, I know some people say this is not the worst menu system, but I like my menus to be quite bare bone. I like the bits I need and nothing else. And unfortunately, when you first come into a Lumix menu, you have 5 or 6 pages that branch off into pages and pages each. And it's a lot. It really is a lot. But the star of the show, the image quality. Oh boy, this is a killer camera for photography, and I don't know why more people aren't talking about it. So again, I have it paired with the 50 f1.8, a £200 lens used, and I have it, like with my Leica Q, with a 1/4 black mist diffusion filter. That's it, just a 1/4 power. And the images out of this thing are absolutely incredible. I'm able to get a really, really nice amount of subject separation. The images are coming out of it insanely tack sharp. The color depth is incredible. And some of the images that I've shot purposefully over or underexposed, the amount of detail you can pull back on a full frame sensor, I'm sorry, I'm going to say it, you can't match it on APS-C. And this is coming from someone that's been shooting APS-C for nearly 10 years at this point. Now, it does also have dual native ISO, and I wanted to really push the boat out and test this. So I actually did a daytime shoot with the ISO set locked at ISO 4000. Some photographers wouldn't even consider shooting at that normally. Me, I'm not bothered about letting ISO raise, but I shot outside in the daytime, specifically at ISO 4000, to test the capabilities of this dual native ISO. And I gotta say, I'm really happy with how the images came out. The grain looked absolutely immaculate, really, really nice, clear details. The grain was tasteful, you know, it wasn't overbearing in any of the images, but I'll let you decide. Here's a couple of examples. The other thing about this setup in general is this is a weather sealed lens, and I do feel it's a lot more sturdy than my X-T4. However, This cheap, in brackets, 50mm f1.8 is also weather sealed, which means I've got a fully weather sealed unit here. And I feel it. I get twitchy with my X-T4 depending on what lens I've got on there. But with this, I've already had this out in some pretty heinous conditions. And again, I've no issues ever taking this out regardless of what that weather is doing. This will be the one camera that I properly abuse no matter what the weather is. Now the final con for me with this lens is weirdly the shutter button. And I know that sounds like a little bit of an odd one. It does have a very typical two-stage shutter release, but you don't really feel the two stages of it. It just kind of feels like one spongy press all the way through. You do get used to it and you feel that focus point, but it's not a crisp, clean half press and then full press. You just kind of sink into it. I've had no issues with it. It's performed well, but I don't like the feel of this shutter button. Again, I know that's very nitpicky, but it's something that as a photographer first, I feel like I should point out. I don't mind the shutter sound, and it does have a fully electronic silent mode. And again, I really like some of the dials on here. Now, I'm not a fan of the spam dial setup usually. However, I can appreciate with this camera, we do have separate buttons specifically for white balance, ISO, and exposure compensation. That means that no matter what you're trying to get to on this camera, there's never a delay to get to it. Whatever you're trying to find, there's already a button for it, and that is really nice. There's a whole range of adjustable function buttons, which is perfect. And this front dial is programmed to whatever mode you're in. If you're in aperture priority, the front dial is your aperture. If you're in shutter priority, the front dial is your shutter. The back dial, you can change what you want it to be, but for me, I always have the back dial set as my exposure. But yeah, that's it. A quick look at the original Lumix S5, and I think it is a freaking fantastic camera for the price. And honestly, if you specifically want to get into full frame, this is without a doubt the best bargain in full frame cameras at this current time. Now again, you've got to bear in mind when you're getting into full frame territory, your cameras are going to be a little bit bigger usually, but more importantly, your lenses are almost always going to be bigger. They're going to be bigger, they're going to be more expensive, and they're just going to get in the way, and you might not be inclined to take them out as much. I've had a look at some of the lenses in the L-mount lineup, and there's some that really appeal to me. But for me, the size of this 50mm f1.8, this is pretty much the sweet spot for me. If you are interested, I will do a full review when I've spent some more time with this camera. Again, this is just a first impressions, but I hope you've enjoyed it. And again, I do have some more Fujifilm content coming soon, so stay around for that, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace. Nope, still feel like shit.